want to ask you one simple and honest question. Have you had your milk this morning? Because since Lance Stroll did something, I've got plenty of it, and actually that smells better than some of my takes. If you're unfamiliar with the incident between Daniel Ricciardo and Lance Stroll, I'd be very surprised if you were, since it's all that anybody's talking about. You know, aside from Lando Norris blowing the socks off of his own team. But in short, Lance Stroll took a crash course in Valtteri Bottas's bowling school and, well, crashed into the racing bulls of Ricciardo. You might be familiar with the idea of sport and drama, and that, in a way, it can be incredibly inescapable. But what we saw also during the Chinese Grand Prix is that drama can easily go away so long as you diffuse it immediately and know how to handle it. Case in point, being the fracas during the sprint concerning the Ferraris. Both Carlos and Charles came together about a couple of times. One time they were literally banging wheels, and in other times they were having really good battles, this time with Fernando Alonso, who got an even worse penalty than Lance Stroll ultimately got. He got 3 penalty points, whereas Lance got 2, and no one really lost any time for it. In fact, Alonso came off worse. I don't know what the stewards were drinking. Maybe they were drinking this expired milk. Why have I even got this? Much like with last year at the Italian Grand Prix during the no-risk moment between the two drivers, they were quick to defuse the situation, says there was nothing untoward about it, there were no ulterior motives, and that both drivers had reconciled and that all was good. To make sure that that didn't linger over the weekend and compromise their overall mentality. The situation between Stroll and Ricciardo had not been diffused. In fact, it's just got even worse for the fact that Lance will just not take any accountability. He has been doubling down on the situation, not taking any personal blame, seemingly blaming Daniel for it, and the team is backing him up, enabling him, which means that this whole situation about a lack of remorse on Lance Stroll will just not go away. Even after 6 months since the Qatar incident, where we all thought that maybe Lance Stroll had learned about taking responsibility and apologizing for stuff, well, the Chinese Grand Prix in this situation has just proved that, no, that's not the case. And he was also giving an inkling that maybe in a way it was Max Verstappen's fault for dictating the pace of the entire grid, since he'd become the safety car at that point, and then he would decide when the race would start. But at the same time, that's standard procedure, and granted, yes, Max Verstappen does have a certain amount of responsibility for dictating the pace of the overall grid. But so do everybody else to some extent. And in a way, he sort of jokingly took responsibility because he watched the incident alongside Norris and Checo, sarcastically said, "Oh yeah, it's my fault." Also, his reactions at watching the incident take place and it happening also gives you a really good indication about, yeah, Stroll was at fault here because Max was so animated about it. This isn't the first time that Daniel and Lance have come together in the middle of a race. You might be surprised by that, but you want to know why you might be surprised at it? Because when that last incident happened in 2022, Daniel took responsibility and the matter was completely swept under the rug and people forgot about it. Because he took accountability! Back in 2022 at the Hungarian Grand Prix, Ricciardo and Stroll came together at turn 2, which resulted in the Australian getting a 5-second time penalty and 2 penalty points on his license when the McLaren locked up and pinged Stroll off of the track and down the order. But in that situation, Daniel didn't pin the blame on Lance or somebody else. He held his hand up and said, "Yeah, I kind of knew that was going to happen. I tried the best I could to avoid it, but I realized it was going to happen and it wasn't going to end well," and admittedly said that the penalty was completely fair. So he immediately diffused the situation, and later on, he did find Lance Stroll after the race had finished, and they both reconciled. They even had a laugh together. They could move on with their respective season campaigns. And this was in the middle of Daniel Ricciardo having a crisis in confidence because Oscar Piastri was going to replace him at McLaren for next year, and he didn't have a seat for 2023. So he was already dealing with tons of personal demons. He was dealing with a car that he just simply could not handle. And then he could have had a chance of getting a decent result, but then he tangled with Lance, he held his hand up, he was mature about it. Say what you will about Daniel's performance in 2022, he at least knows when to hold his hand up, and that was a good example of it. Fast forward to now, and Daniel's future is in equal amounts of doubt, and he has had another collision with Lance Stroll. Daniel was absolutely livid, uncharacteristically so. I've not seen him this angry since that 2018 moment when he was cussing and screaming under his helmet. And that's why this whole news has made the headlines and why it's not dissipated over the coming hours after the event. We're used to seeing him being quite easygoing and keen to get over an incident, or at least talk it through with another driver, and be quite verbose and amiable during a press conference. But no. Throughout every single interview that he was conducting, he showed a degree of anger or resentment or just dismissive weariness. He just got madder and madder. He thought he could calm down, but no. It just would not go away. Maybe he recalled that event in 2022 when he had compromised Lance's race, but then took responsibility and apologized for it. He would expect that if that were to happen again between the two drivers, that Lance would reciprocate and that he would do the same and take responsibility and apologize for ruining Ricciardo's race, which was looking pretty handy at that time. And that's what probably has gotten under Ricciardo's skin the most. There was no indication of an apology or even paying serious attention. Stroll probably assuming that everyone ahead of him would do the heavy lifting for him, as he was actively looking at the hairpin ready for Max to take the restart. But why? He can't overtake before the safety car line anyway. That's a good couple of 100 or 300 meters away. Why would you be even looking that far ahead? You should be looking straight ahead where all of the other drivers are. In that footage, you can see that he's vaguely looking at where Max and Lando are, the first two drivers, and then see if Max goes, then he can maybe make a leap for it. But no, instead, Lance didn't even refer to Ricciardo initially by name. He just referred to as, oh, someone else was not paying attention and broke early or something like that. He was referring to someone, not even giving a name. But in a way, if he did want to blame somebody by name, he could technically blame his teammate because he did lock up while he was on a different tyre, and that did cause the concertina effect. But then you could also argue that Sainz then realised he wasn't paying attention, but then he could brake, but there was space between he and Alonso. It gets a little bit technical, but other drivers ahead of him were doing what they were supposed to do, and they were giving plenty of space, or they broke in time, or at least they were looking ahead of them. And then he started to say that, oh, he had nowhere to go, and Karun Chandhok sort of justified that, but again, look at the footage. There's plenty of space on the right. If he had been paying attention and then realised that Daniel Ricciardo was slowing a bit faster than he should do normally, he could then just veer off to the right, and sure, he might have to give the place back to Daniel, but he would still be in the race and have a chance of getting a double points finish for Aston Martin after all, because as Stroll said at the time, he was looking potentially on for P8 or P9. Yeah, it was the worst outcome. And then saying that, oh, other people were not doing their job as well. And then Oscar comes in with the retort going, yeah, well, nobody else crashed. It's true. No one else crashed when Max was concertinaing people or when Daniel had that situation. In fact, Daniel, whilst he had a car up his backside, was doing his best to not crash into Oscar harder than he actually did. In the end, Daniel just clipped Oscar. Sure, it compromised Oscar's race, which meant that he couldn't go after Russell and he had to drive out of his skin to keep Lewis behind him, but it was a lot better than it could have been. Daniel did all that he could to avoid an even worse incident, where two drivers would have had a DNF. Also, when a multiple world champion is viewing back that footage and seeing what you're doing and is going, oh my god, those words are his, not mine, and then he's going... It's important to listen to what Daniel said afterward, in that he viewed the onboard of Stroll after he got out of the car, probably to try and understand what had happened. Had Lance Stroll been genuinely caught off guard and that maybe Daniel was to blame? That Lance had done all he could to try and brake in time, that he was looking ahead and paying attention, but there was genuinely no room to try and escape or evade? Well, no, that wasn't the case. And what Daniel saw pissed him off. And yes, I know that you might be saying, well, typically, a driver should be looking at the apex of the next corner anyway to hit that mark and get the right racing line out of it, slow in, fast out. Yes, that is what you should be doing in green light normal racing conditions, not during a safety car. Because you have no idea what's going to happen around you. It's like turn one. You have to be on your toes all the time until normal racing conditions have resumed and there's a bit more of a gap between other drivers. But fortunately, Daniel was able to calm down a little bit. But what pissed him off again is because Lance was not taking any responsibility or accountability whatsoever. He was pinning the blame exclusively on Daniel for why his race was compromised, why he got a 10-second penalty because he thought that was a complete joke, as did his team boss supposedly, and that Daniel should be getting the blame. And then it just was a complete cycle. It just kept perpetuating. Daniel would calm down, but then would be reminded about the egregiousness of it all, and then would be angry again. And I've never seen Daniel this angry and for this long. Even now, the day after the incident, Daniel is still calling for Lance to accept responsibility, but he has now reduced the level of pissed offness, but instead is now looking in a more diplomatic sort of way, as he says here. Ahem. For me, the biggest thing is if they're like, oh, we'll give him a 5-place penalty the next race, but he is still then blaming me. That's a bigger problem. I want him to understand once the dust settles, if he's still hot-headed today, he needs to learn from this. We've all made mistakes. I've done it. We all have. As long as he understands that he was the one that's ruined not only his race but mine, that's the biggest thing we can take away. You see, Daniel isn't calling for his head, he's just asking Lance to use his head and just think, maybe I was to blame and that maybe I should learn from this to make sure it doesn't happen again. History has shown us that he probably won't, because this isn't the first time that Lance has been caught with his pants down and not paying attention to what's been going on around him. 3 instances come to mind. First off, Bahrain last year, again, his teammate sort of being involved. There's turn 4, and he's looking at the cars ahead of him and completely missed his own teammate until the very last nanosecond where they did collide. Alonso's car control was the thing that saved his own race, as he could have easily spun out and not given Aston Martin the dream podium that they would have never expected. But as you can see, Lance was looking at the corner, not at Fernando, until it was almost too late. Then there was the weird incident with the Williams in Melbourne 2022, where he was moving about and collided with Latifi, which ended both their races. And then let's not forget the strangest one of all, Sepang 2017, after the race had finished, on the cooldown lap. Vettel was just minding his own business, whereas Lance was probably minding his own business, a little bit too much probably, and then they both collided, which saw Vettel having to get a lift back to the pits, and then Lance coming back to the grid with a damaged Williams for some reason. Lance isn't paying attention to the cars around him, and instead, he's looking way too far down the road. This is the kind of mistake you would expect from a rookie, not a driver who is coming up towards having 150 Grand Prix starts. That's a crazy amount to think about. 150 Grand Prix, and you're still making these kind of mistakes. It does make me wonder in a way, and this is actually kind of serious, that if Lance Stroll hadn't been warned ahead of time by his pit crew that George Russell had a stricken car in Melbourne and that he couldn't get out and that it was on its side, that he might not have been paying attention to it, and that it might have ultimately led to a collision where George could have been seriously injured. Yes, I know. I think he would have had at least a little bit of sense to pay attention to a stricken car that wasn't moving, but it does make you think that maybe Lance won't learn from this, that he will just carry on doing what he's doing because there's no call for him to change. His seat's not under threat, and his boss has got his back, so why worry about it? He can feel justified at pointing the finger at everybody else. And this is an attitude that people are getting sick and tired of. Him not taking responsibility and placing the blame and pointing the finger at other people. The excuses are wearing thin. In fact, I think they just worn out entirely. We're at the canvas here, folks. It's bad enough that Mike Crack, his team boss, blurted out the real purpose of Aston Martin the other day, but now he's got Lance's corner by saying the 10-second penalty and the 2 penalty points that he got was a surprise and very harsh. What? No, a 10-second penalty now is the standard because the drivers lobbied for it, instead of a 5-second penalty, which in theory you could get around by, clever strategy or just driving a little bit faster. No, they increased that to 10 seconds where it becomes a genuine problem and something you really can't overcome. You also want to know what's harsh, aside obviously from the fact that Alonso got more penalty points for an incident that really didn't affect anyone else but himself, but that Daniel Ricciardo got a penalty of his own, and that got 2 penalty points, and it should have gotten 10 seconds, but because he retired, it was to do with safety car conditions and overtaking Hulkenberg and misunderstanding, and then he wasn't able to make up for it. It then leads to, in Miami, Daniel getting a 3-place grid penalty. So in a way, Daniel Ricciardo has come out absolutely horribly from this, whereas Lance Stroll has gotten off relatively scot-free. Sure, his race was compromised thanks to a 10-second stop-go penalty effectively, but at least he was able to continue. He had no one else to blame for that situation but himself, because as he admitted, he could have had points had he been paying attention. He denied Aston Martin a double points finish, and capping off a really solid weekend for them, whilst Fernando Alonso was able to make a really questionable pit stop strategy, a 3-stopper with a soft tyre stint, absolutely work and get back up to 7th. Sure, it's not 5th place, it's not the 3rd place where he qualified on the grid, but it's points. I don't think anyone else other than Fernando would have been able to do that. So it's another reason for Daniel to be angry, because losing 3 places for the next race is another blow in the fight for him keeping his racing bull seat away from Liam Lawson, most likely. And it's a real shame too, because you got to look at the entire weekend. Daniel looked like the better driver than Yuki. Yuki was lost at sea. Unlike the previous races, he had a really good run, and he was able to capitalize over Daniel in the initial races after Bahrain and that wake-up call. This time around though, Daniel looked like the more convincing driver. He had a really good qualifying result, he had a decent sprint, and he looked odds on to try and at least get a point or two for the team and consolidate their 6th place position, and really maybe take some of the heat off of his position within the team, and maybe try and get to the summer break without having to worry about his F1 future, and maybe just relax a little bit. It's another DNF on his docket sheet. It makes his job of convincing the Red Bull higher-ups that he's worth keeping around, and that his 2023 Mexico performance was not an exception, but would become the rule. So what he didn't need was Lance Stroll to clash into him and then end his race, damage the car, which will cost a lot to repair because a diffuser, that's a really technical bit of kit. That's effectively replacing the floor now. But Lance isn't going to care about this. No, his future isn't something to worry about. I could easily imagine that Lance would only finish in F1 when he says, "Dad, I'm bored of this, I want to do something else." And then he could go and hold his head high that he ended his F1 career on his own terms and not through anybody else. You know, as he says, he takes one day at a time. Tomorrow's another day in the office. It's all good, just forget about that, move on to the next race. Not many other drivers can say that. And also, in a way, you could argue that his conduct throughout the entire Chinese Grand Prix weekend is probably the worst, the biggest blot on his form sheet. The whole situation about his ability and skill, that's becoming old and tired at this point. What's becoming more and more apparent is his attitude and how much it stinks. There's no real emotion or any inclination to reconcile with drivers or show some sense of maturity and just hold your hand up and say, "Yeah, okay, that was on me, my bad." That's an important skill to have, my friend. Being able to admit your own faults and own up to it. That's why I poke fun at myself sometimes. I can show humility about how some of my takes age like milk, how my hair moves around because of the draft coming out of the loft hole, and why I'm on a ladder. I can just make light of myself and just show that, you know, don't stress over it. But Lance can't show humility. I don't know why, but it's becoming more apparent and more people are getting frustrated about it. And it's becoming the biggest issue and the biggest red flag that he has, aside from the fact he can't really drive the Aston Martin car as well as his teammate. If he had owned up to the whole situation or sought Ricciardo out after to resolve the matter in private, then the matter would have fizzled out after the penalties had been issued, and that would have been that. But much like with the shoving incident in Qatar, the lack of remorse or immediate addressing of the issue would mean that the world would keep on talking about it for days to come. And it makes you think again, has Lance Stroll ever apologized for something that he was involved in and meant it? That he didn't need the FIA to basically mandate him to apologize in public for something that he had done, that he'd done it on his own volition? I tried to look up instances where he had apologized over the years, but I couldn't find them. If you can, you're a better researcher than I am, and leave it down in the comment, and I truly appreciate it. I'm not asking for Lance Stroll to get down on his knees and apologize and just proclaim in woe and going, "Oh, woe is me, I'm sorry." No, I'm not asking for that. I'm just asking him to go, "Yeah, I should have probably paid attention to the cars ahead of me. That's on me. Sorry, Daniel." That he was accountable for taking out Daniel and compromising Oscar's race at the same time. But we got none of that, and the team continues to enable him to think that way. Sure, he might not like the limelight of Formula One, he might be a very private person, but at the same time, you are a public figure. I'm a public figure. And there is a certain amount of responsibility that you have to conduct yourself in a mature manner, which is a good role model for people. There are children who watch Formula One. I will admit, my newborn baby is fascinated with Formula One cars. I want the drivers who are racing at that time to be good examples, and not something where I have to explain to my child that, yeah, don't pay attention to them, that's not a good look. It's not a skill issue solely anymore, it's more of a personality issue instead. Lance has made a rod for his own back, and whilst in the here and now he probably doesn't care about that situation and just cares about himself, I think the entities that are going to be circling themselves around Aston Martin might have a few things to say about it, because as we've seen, Honda and Aramco have big aspirations for 2026, with Honda hoping to go for the championship title immediately, their first year with Aston Martin. Those are big statements to hear from Honda. And Aramco, Saudi Arabia, they like to have the best. They like to hire the best. And right now, with Stroll, as he is he the best? No, of course not. If I were a representative of either Honda or Aramco, I'd be going up to Papa Stroll and saying, are you really serious in wanting to be world champions? Because right now your lineup is saying no, you're not serious. Right now, they've got one hand tied behind their back. They're having to rely on Fernando Alonso making that car dance way higher than the 5th fastest car. And the confession that Mike Crack put out the other day is just adding more fuel to the fire that it's either Fernando or Lance or just Lance or something that is completely suboptimal. Something that I talk about more, that confession, in this video, you can go and watch next, and it's a doozy, even though it's something we already know, but it's like, why did you say the quiet part out loud, Mike? Why?